First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this 11th webinar of a series of webinars organized by APC in Abu Dhabi to foresee the repercussions of the coronavirus crisis on the world and the region, and the second webinar dedicated for Libyan crisis. The first webinar, which was held last June, touched upon the nature of the crisis among Libyan rivals and explored the Libyans' perspectives for prospect of the conflict between military victory and political agreement. This webinar deals with the reality of competition between foreign powers over geopolitical and economic interests in Libya, and attempts to foresee the prospects of the ongoing regional fight over Libya. Last May and June, forces and militias which belonged to the Libyan government of national accord, led by Faiz al-Sarraj, were able to overturn military balance by driving forces of the Libyan National Army, led by Khalifa Haftar, out of cities in Libya's west coast, Tripoli and its suburb, Al-Watiya air base, and up to the outskirts of the Sirte and Al-Jafra air base in the middle of the country. This military victory by the forces of the government of national accord was not attainable without the huge military support by Turkey in the wake of game changer. Maritime and security agreements with the Tripoli governments in November 2019. This military victory has increased Ankara's appetite for harvesting the fruits of its intervention through enhancing its military influence by building military bases in Libya, and achieve its economic interests by sealing a deal for the exploration of oil and gas of the Libyan shores. However, the foreign intervention in Libya was not limited to Turkey. The opposite side, I mean Haftar forces, have also received varying support from Russia, France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates. These countries perceive Turkey's expanding influence in Libya as a threat to their geopolitical interests. Countries that support Eastern Libya faction have called for a ceasefire and a start for a peaceful settlement for the conflict. Egypt has launched the Cairo Initiative in June 6 with participation of Aqila Saleh and Speaker of the House of Representatives in Tobruk, and Khalifa Haftar. So the government of national accord has rejected calls for a ceasefire. Ankara also rejected calls to launch the political track to solve the conflict. While Turkey has continued to provide forces of the government of national accord with weapons and immunities to enhance their military buildup in preparation for the Battle of Sirte and Al-Jafra, the other party is doing the same thing in supporting Haftar forces. Egypt is even preparing to intervene militarily in Libya should forces of the government of national accord cross Sirte Al-Jafra line, which constitutes a red line for Cairo. The interactions of the geopolitical conflict have been manifested on the ground in Libya by actors supporting different parties to conflict, particularly by Turkey on one side and Egypt, France and Russia on the other. Of course, not to mention indirect interaction of other global and regional actors such as US, EU, and African Union, Algeria, and Tunisia. Based on the latest field and political developments in the Libyan conflict, three facts came to light. First, the conflict, there is development from Libyan struggle into a regional war. Second, the zero-sum game does not govern only the Libyan warring factions, but also foreign competing actors in this front. Third, it seems that the decision of war and peace is no longer in the hands of the Libyan, but rather in those of foreign powers. We hold this webinar today to discuss the future of the Libyan conflict and the interaction of relevant influential actors in this issue, where we host a select of non-Libyan experts and panelists and specialists in the Libyan affairs. Those include Dr. Michael O'Halloran, Director of Research and the Senior Fellow in Security and Strategic Affairs at the Brookings Institution, and Dr. Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, RIAC, and a prominent expert in Russia foreign policy affairs and contemporary international relations. And His Excellency Peter Millet, the former British ambassador to Libya from 2015 to 2018. And of course, our friend, Dr. Omar Tashpinar, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute and a Professor of National Security Strategy at the National War College in Washington, D.C. I would like to welcome all of our speakers for today and thank them for accepting our invitation to participate in this event. I would also like to welcome the audience who attends this webinar, which is live streamed on EPC's account on various social media platforms and the Center's YouTube channel via Zoom application. Before I give the floor to the speaker, I would like to draw attention of our Arab viewers that they can listen to the Arabic interpretation of the discussion by clicking on the interpretation or the language button down the screen and choose French channel to listen to the Arabic interpretation. At first, I would like to ask every speaker to give us an initial intervention for 3 minutes on the topic of our today discussion before we start our Q&A. And I wish to start with Dr. Michael O'Halloran. Thank you. Please, Dr. Michael. Dr. Michael.
Good day, and thank you for the chance to be with you. I hope you can now hear me.
Yes, please.
And I would just like to make 2 points to begin, and I'm very privileged and grateful for the chance to be part of this illustrious seminar. First, we all know that Libya is not going to ultimately be ruled completely by either Haftar or the government of national accord. They're both too weak. They both want some of the power the other has, and a complete victory militarily is unattainable and unrealistic. And I think this point needs to be widely accepted by everyone, rather than have outside powers continue to believe their own respective proxy can win somehow and take power for the whole country. Second, I think that any kind of power sharing will have to be essentially city-based and region-based, And there will have to be some very loose central structure to oversee the various activities of the individual city-based mini governments and mini armies. Now, Haftar controls fairly large swaths of the east, so his area may wind up being more than a city. So there may have to be a bit of a mixed model of cities and regions. But I think we have to understand Libya is going to be a patchwork of small local governance stitched together loosely by a central government. And that's the best case scenario for the foreseeable future. Just one last point, which is that because this kind of outcome will leave ambiguous the question of who controls the oil and the central oil crescent, I believe that some kind of a UN observation force will be needed to help reassure everyone that in fact the oil infrastructure and infrastructure in the country is respected and oil export shared across the different small governance and regions. And I think a UN force can do that even without having the muscularity or the military power to enforce that by its actual weaponry, but more because of the independence that it would have as an observation capability in order to provide reassurance and confidence. I will leave my opening remarks at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Kortunov, please. Andre? It seems he's frozen. Okay, I'll move to Ambassador Peter.
Hi, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this event. I'll make two main introductory comments. And recall that 5 years ago, I was in Sahara in Morocco, helping the United Nations to negotiate the agreement that was eventually signed on the 17th of December 2015, known as the Sahara Agreement. Now, that agreement clearly has failed, and I would like to identify two main reasons for that. There's many reasons for it, but to highlight two main points. One is internal. The participants and the signatories were only 25 very good, very well-meaning Libyans, but the stakeholders were not broad enough and the content was not complete enough. There were not enough tribal, military, municipal, economic stakeholders in that agreement. It was really only the House of Representatives and the GNC who were the main participants in that agreement. So any future deal has to ensure that it has a much broader range of stakeholders and a much more complete agenda. The agenda of the Sahara Agreement was primarily political. It did not include, it covered security and economic, but in a very superficial way. There would need to be a complete program for the future political, security, and economic future of Libya. That's the first internal point. It was not complete or broad enough. The second point is external. The international community actually came together at Sahara and supported the United Nations in reaching that agreement. And within a couple of days, it was endorsed unanimously by a Security Council resolution. But even at that time, some of the countries you have mentioned, Doctor, were saying one thing and doing something else, undermining that agreement by arming some of the military factions on the ground. And since then, we've seen, as you have described, the international community fragment and build itself into two competing alliances, which has undermined the United Nations and undermined the Libyan citizens who simply want stability, security, and prosperity. So trying to bring the international community together, as you've said, the decision-making is in the hands of others, but any deal has to be agreed by Libyans and supported by a cohesive international support for the United Nations. I'll leave it there and look forward to answering questions as we go through.
Thank you. Andre, can you please, do you hear us, Dr. Andre?
Yeah, let me I have a couple of specific ideas on what we should do in Libya, but let me first start with how I understand the Russian position on Libya. And they often make a comparison between what Russia is doing in Libya and what it is doing in Syria. I think that this comparison is not correct, since the Russian strategy in Libya is very different from what Moscow is doing in Syria. And let me limit myself to only 3 dimensions of this difference. First of all, I think that the Russian engagement in Libya is much smaller than its support to Damascus. So one can argue that in Libya, Russia does not really punch above its weight. Second, in Libya, Russia tries to diversify its political investment portfolio. Therefore, though the general perception is that Moscow supports mostly Haftar and forces around Haftar, but it also tries to maintain good relations with the government of Sarraj. And again, in this sense, Russia does not make any final choice like in Syria, and it is trying to secure its position no matter how the situation in Libya might evolve. And finally, I think that in Syria, Russian interests can be described in geopolitical terms, while in Libya, it's not so much about geopolitics, it is probably more about economics. Syria is poor, Syria is almost destroyed, and of course, Syria is not really a good economic investment, while Libya might offer a number of lucrative economic opportunities for the energy sector, for the defense sector, for infrastructure companies, and other businesses interested in getting involved in Libya.
Thank you, Andre. Dr. Omar? Your mic, please, Omar. Can you unmute it?
Sorry, thank you. I'd like to make 3 quick points about Turkey's position and 1 overall general point about the situation in Libya more broadly. The reason why Turkey got involved in Libya can be analyzed at different levels. Obviously, there is Libya itself, where Turkey has deep financial interests going back to the construction companies involved in Gaddafi's time. The second level is basically Turkey's, this is part of Turkey's overall geopolitical, geostrategic struggle in the Middle East with what it considers status quo countries like Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Egypt. Turkey is more of a, I would say, revolutionary country right now, which wants to see change in the region. It is supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. It is supportive of governments that are closer to its ideological position. And more importantly, Erdogan sees the Muslim Brotherhood, both in Egypt and in the region, as the democratization of the region, as people coming to power. So there's that level. The third level is very important, the Eastern Mediterranean gas and oil exploration and pipelines politics. And here Turkey is unable to play a constructive role. It's playing basically the role of a spoiler. Turkey can basically paralyze the situation through its maritime agreement with Libya and engage in its own attempts at oil and gas exploration and try to block any kind of future projects of exploration in the region. There's also a domestic dimension for Erdogan. Erdogan is in trouble at home because of the economic situation, and he desperately needs to divert attention from the problems of governance that he's facing at home. And Libya is a victory for him because he managed to change the situation, the military situation on the ground rather quickly, and he can project this as a kind of geostrategic victory for Turkey. It's also a victory for Turkish maritime strategy, of a blue homeland strategy, of a more assertive foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean. The larger point I'd like to make about Libya and the future of Libya dovetails with what my friend Michael O'Hanlon made. It is true that it's unlikely that Libya will be governed by a strong central government. However, we are still at the stage of a civil war, and civil war ends usually when there is mutually hurting stalemate, when there is a kind of sense of ripeness and two parties are basically coming to an understanding that they will not be able to win the war. And I'm afraid right now, with the momentum that Turkey has established in the defense of Tripoli, there is a sense that Turkey militarily can push for a bigger, a more maximalist strategy in Sirte and Jufra, and that the mutually hurting stalemate does not really apply. So there is room for miscalculation, especially on Turkey's part, with the belief that with a little bit more of a military investment, military projection, the tide can easily turn to the favor of the GNA, to Sarraj, Government of National Accord, and Turkey can come to the table much stronger in order to get basically 80% of the spoils. And this is what I'm afraid of as a kind of difficult situation where the situation is ripe for miscalculations. We're not really there in terms of a mutually hurting stalemate. There's a sense of that Ankara can invest a little bit more and can come much stronger to the negotiation table down the line. Let me end here, and I'll be happy to answer questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Omar. Well, I'll start the Q&A by a question. I will. It's for all of you, and I will start with Andre. How do you interpret power mapping in the fight for Libya landscape in the light of the recent developments of the conflict? Andre, can you unmute your...
Yeah, I got it, yeah. Well, I think that unfortunately, at this particular juncture, we are moving away from a settlement. There were expectations after the meetings in Moscow and in Berlin that maybe a political process might somehow help to change the situation, to change the momentum. However, I think that maybe because major external powers were distracted by other problems, maybe because all fighting sides in Syria still hope to get a military victory. But unfortunately, I see a clear deterioration of the situation and a lot of potential for further escalation, involving not just the internal powers in Libya, but also external players. I think this is a dangerous situation, and this is something that should be definitely changed. In my opinion, what we should do at this particular juncture, we should move beyond the Sahara Agreement of 2015. I would call an agreement which I would, a Sahara II agreement. Let's not forget that the previous agreement was not recognized by all the fighting sides in Syria. I think that we should come in a much more forceful way to make sure that there'll be no interference into the Libyan conflict from abroad, including the ban on arms transfers for Libya. I think that if you take Russia, we should somehow clarify the role of the so-called Russian private military companies in Libya, because right now they operate in a gray zone. And I think that if there is a major effort by major stakeholders in Libya, that might reverse the current negative momentum, and that might move us close to an agreement. Though I don't think that any agreement can come anytime soon. I think that the potential for fighting, the resource for fighting is still very significant in Libya, and it would be extremely difficult to turn the momentum.
Thank you, Andre. Michael, did you hear my question? Michael, can you unmute your microphone, please?
Thank you. If you wouldn't mind, just, are you able to hear me now?
Yeah. So
Yes.
can you answer my question, please?
Yes, I was going to just ask if you could reformulate it in light of the very, very excellent comment by my Russian colleague.
My question was, how do you interpret power mapping in the fight for Libyan landscape in light of recent developments of the conflict?
Well, if I could build on what my good friend Omer Tashbinar, as well as our Russian colleague, both have said, I think that power is shifting frequently, and unfortunately, a lot of people tend towards overconfidence. They see a recent tactical success, and it makes them believe they can have a strategic victory. And because Libya is, big in one sense, but also relatively small in another sense, since it only has 6 million people, only has a few major cities, and only has a small part of the country that's really populated, it's always tempting to believe that whatever recent success you might have had is the harbinger of a major shift in your fortunes more generally. Just like a sports team that just scored a goal in football usually feels confident at that moment, but it doesn't mean they're really going to be the next one to score the next goal. So I share Omer Tashbinar's concern that various parties will, and maybe now Turkey, along with the government of national accord, will tend towards overconfidence. And that's part of why I believe that the only realistic hope is if we inject some new kind of concept into the conversation. Not so much power sharing, because power sharing always begins from the realities on the ground, which are in dispute and constantly shifting. So that's why I mentioned this UN observation force, combined with some kind of an agreement on revenue sharing that's a little more specific and binding than what we've had so far. Then the UN observation force could deploy in Tripoli, but also around the oil crescent, and observe that there was in fact proper utilization of those oil facilities and proper sharing of the revenue according to a scheme that gave the different local power brokers some fair share of the money, as long as they provided services for the people in the area where they were in control. And to me, that's the general concept that we should be after. Otherwise, because things shift so fast, no one's going to agree on what the right formula for simple power sharing should be.
Thank you. Ambassador Peter, your take, please.
Yeah, just to add to the excellent comments from the previous two speakers, when you're talking about power mapping, I'm always struck by the fragmentation of both political and military power in Libya. The multiple militias in Tripoli, most of whom are just venal criminal groups. And even what you called earlier, Doctor, the Libyan National Army is not a Libyan National Army. They don't even call it that in Libya. It's the Libyan Arab Armed Forces, Quwat Musallaha al-Arabiya in Libya. It is not Libyan because it is supported by mercenaries. It is not national because it excludes a lot of the tribes of Libya. And it's not an army because it's a group of militias. Even some of the senior members are wanted by the International Criminal Court. So that fragmentation is what is preventing Libyans from coming together with a sense of the greater national good of the nation. And there are people within senior political positions and military positions who are very satisfied with the status quo. They're making a lot of money out of it, and who will undermine and resist any new effort to bring about a political solution. Clearly, a ceasefire is absolutely essential. There needs to be some sort of political deal, at least an interim political deal, to maintain the peace while there is a negotiation going on. I very much agree with the main points that Dr. Michael O'Hanlon has made about the need for a UN force of some sort, as an observer force at least. The Libyans always used to say to me, we do not want boots on the ground. I think that's a bit of a myth. I think most Libyan citizens would welcome an international observer force which helps to guarantee a new peaceful process. but coupled within, talking about power mapping, whatever new political deal is done, it has to get the buy-in from these multiple military players. There has to be a major security sector reform and DDR process to support it, so that that whatever peace can be brought about in the future can be observed by the UN. They can call out those who are undermining it and any international countries who are violating the arms embargo. It's going to be a very complicated and difficult process. And I think, as Dr. Andrea said, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Omar?
In terms of power mapping, if we look at external powers that are interested in Libya, the situation is exacerbated by the fact that big players such as Russia, United States, the European Union, seem to be contradicting each other. There is not really a single vision for Libya. And making things worse in terms of the European Union, which arguably has the most at stake because of immigration, refugees, the Mediterranean, the closeness of Libya, Eastern Mediterranean questions. The question of Henry Kissinger comes to mind. Who do I talk to in Europe when it comes to foreign policy? Give me a phone number. The French position seems to be different than the Italian position. The Greek position is different. The Germans are at a different level. So there is not a single European position. When it comes to the United States, I don't see the Trump administration, short of a major Russian intervention in Libya, taking really strong position or paying much attention, investing political capital really in Libya. The most important issue right now, I think, for the Trump administration is to avoid basically a kind of Russian domination of the scene, to avoid a kind of Syria situation where Russia intervenes and changes everything. And second, to avoid a major escalation between two allies, one NATO ally, Turkey, and the other one Middle Eastern ally, Egypt. If Turkey and Egypt goes to what appears to be a kind of proxy war over Jufra and Sirte, this could attract some attention in Washington, D.C. But right now it's in pandemic and election season, and I don't see, and my friend Michael O'Hanlon can correct me, I don't see much the White House investing a lot in Libya. And the United Nations will require, in case of the United Nations, when things go to the United Nations, it's usually when great powers are unable to really find a solution. And there is the Security Council situation. And I could easily see this dragging out in the United Nations Security Council, the way Syria dragged out, because Russia and the United States and potentially France would be on different places. Turkey will play the role of a spoiler. And one last point about Turkey's miscalculation also as a kind of major military player. A few weeks ago, there was an attack on Al-Watiya air base, where Turkey has its drone center. And this attack on Al-Watiya air base was an attempt to gauge Turkey's air defense capability. And Turkey's air defense capability proved quite vulnerable. It was not able to protect, really. So this could have tempered, to a certain degree, Turkey's maximalist overconfidence, but it did not. It kind of reinforced that, we don't have much time. There has to be some investment now. So I'm afraid that we're heading towards a confrontation where Turkey is miscalculating, and the Egyptian reaction right now is also escalating. This could create some attention in Washington, but I'm not 100% sure to what degree there will be much focus in terms of great powers.
Thank you. Michael, can you tell us what is the American strategic perception of Libya? Has Washington built its strategy towards the conflict there based on lessons learned from its war in Iraq, Afghanistan, or what is it exactly?
It's an excellent question, and I will build on Omer Tashbinar's point, because I think he's correct that there really is no likelihood of any significant American attention on this question, tragically, in the next few months, at least. And in the course of the Trump administration, I don't know if the president ever took any interest except in the one phone call where he apparently showed some support for Mr. Haftar until he was talked out of that position by his own administration right after the call. Otherwise, I think he's essentially ignored Libya because, as you know, Trump doesn't really like Middle Eastern politics or conflicts to begin with. And Libya is generally seen by American strategists as a secondary issue, even within the broader Middle East. In the last few months, maybe the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of American strategists talk about the Middle East as a region where we need to avoid further commitment. We need to minimize our sense of its importance. Frankly, I believe some of this conversation is going too far in the opposite direction from the big interventions of the early 2000s in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the atmosphere is extremely wary of any kind of greater role, which means that, frankly, a country like Libya doesn't even get much serious thought. I don't even think that, it's being discussed very much, except by Libya specialists. So I'm very glad you're having this forum today, because it does give us some opportunity to continue to try to keep Libya on the radar screen. Otherwise, there's only a handful of people in Washington who are known for continually researching Libya and staying on top of the question. And I think many of them have been discouraged by the events of the last year to year and a half, and don't really know how to push for any big new initiative at this juncture. So I'm sorry to be so discouraging, because I do think the American role would be important here, partly because other outside powers are seen as competing with each other. And therefore, if we're going to have some kind of successful international effort that avoids proxy warfare dynamics, I think it would require a stronger American role. I just don't think that's realistic anytime soon. The last point I'll make, and I'll finish on this, there are some American experts, even Middle Eastern experts, who I've heard before say something that I consider to be untrue and incorrect, but nonetheless fairly prevalent, which is what happens in Libya stays in Libya. Libya is the Las Vegas of the Middle East, they'll say. What happens there stays there, because it's far away from Israel, it's far away from the Suez Canal, it's far away from Saudi Arabia, it's far away from Iran. But of course, this comment is not true, because we've seen extremist fighters go from Libya to the ISIS and Al-Qaeda dominated regions of Iraq and Syria over the last 20 years. We've seen many migrants move through Libya, as Omer pointed out earlier, en route to Europe. And so there is no way to quarantine off Libya, and we're foolish if we think we can. Unfortunately, that remains the prevalent American attitude.
Michael, I have a question I cannot hold myself not to ask you, because in terms of the role of the American in the Middle East, if you can just name it, prioritize countries in the Middle East in terms of its importance for US. You will put the Gulf first, Iraq first. Can you just tell us? I mean, just name.
Well, in terms of enduring important countries, clearly we have the big three in terms of population of Egypt, Iran, and Turkey. One of them is an adversary of the United States. One is sort of a frenemy, if you will, a friend and a problem at the same time. That's Sisi in Egypt. And then the last is a complicated ally with some of the same characteristics of Sisi, but of course, as Omer pointed out, with a more revolutionary worldview, and that's Erdogan in Turkey. So those three countries always have to be near the top of the list, as does Saudi Arabia because of its oil, as does Israel because of the close American ties. So I would put those five in the first tier. I don't really know how to say one of them is more important than the other. You know, if you're speaking emotionally, Americans tend to say Israel is the most important. If you're speaking economically, people tend to say Saudi Arabia. If you're talking about trouble and nuclear proliferation dangers and terrorism, it's Iran. If you're talking about a powerful foothold for Western interests and American interests in the region, it would be Egypt or Turkey. So I think those 5 have to be in the top tier. I think countries like Iraq are in a second tier, even though they're still important. And they tend to become more important when they become dangers to us, or when danger comes from their territory. They're not necessarily as inherently important as the top 5. That would be how I would begin to try to answer your question, although I'd be fascinated to hear if anybody else on the panel disagrees with me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. I'll move to Andre. So, Andre, what is Russia's strategic perception of its role in the Libyan conflict? Does this perception overlap with Moscow's role in Syria? Andre, can you unmute your...
I think that Syria is definitely much more important for Russia. It is closer to Moscow. It has an impact on neighboring countries, including Central Asia and South Caucasus. And definitely the Russian engagement in Syria is much more fundamental than in Libya. Also, I think that in Libya, Russia has a little bit more flexibility because it has not invested just in one power, let's say Haftar. It tries to maintain workable relations with Tripoli with some moderate success. So I think that the assumption is that we should secure our positions no matter who wins. But in Libya, like in Syria, Russia is a hostage, to some extent at least, a hostage to other players. For example, in Syria, Russia has to keep in mind the Iranian positions. It cannot deviate too far from Iran for a variety of reasons that we can discuss. But in Libya, it has somewhat similar links to Egypt. Egypt is important. Probably Egypt is not as important as Turkey or Iran, but still it's a major priority for Russia in the Middle East. So Russia has to keep in mind the Egyptian connection. At the same time, clear enough, Italy seems to be one of very few EU and NATO countries which are friendly to Russia. So Russia cannot ignore the position of Rome on Libya. Neither it can ignore the French position. Macron will come to Moscow in early September, and definitely Libya will be on the Russian agenda. But let me just underscore once again that the Russian role in Libya seems to be much more limited than its role in Syria. And Russia is not a deal maker, but probably it's a deal taker in Libya. At least that's how I would define its role there.
Excellent, thank you. Ambassador Miller, how European actors perceive the conflict in Libya, and how do their conflicting interests complicate this conflict?
Well, as Dr. Omar has said, the European voice has disappeared. It's unable to come together into a coherent voice. The French have clearly supported Haftar, both militarily and politically. The Italians are closer to the GNA. The Maritime Agreement between the GNA and Turkey has made things even more complicated, with the Greek foreign minister visiting Tobruk, Haftar being welcomed in Athens. So that has meant that the lowest common denominator is silence from the European voice. I think the Germans were engaged by the previous UN Special Envoy, Hassan Salameh, who saw that Germany was a respected neutral country that managed to bring all the key players together to Berlin on the 19th of January and get them to sign up to an agreement calling for a ceasefire, a political process, and so forth. I do think that the German voice, supported by London and Washington, is a way of trying to drive a new political process forward. but the absence of a European voice, which, as Dr. Omar has said, Europe is the closest and has a lot at stake. There are energy issues, there are migration issues, there are terrorism issues. Europe needs a stable and secure Libya, but at the moment it's not playing a very significant role in trying to bring it about.
Thank you. Dr. Omar, how does Turkey perceive the conflict in Libya, and what is the Ankara's strategic interest there?
Well, I think it's safe to say that the big problem Turkey began earlier in the Eastern Mediterranean region when Egypt, Israel, Greece, and the Republic of Cyprus began gas exploration. And they totally sidelined Turkey because of the well-known Cyprus problem. The Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus is an entity that is not recognized by anyone other than Turkey, and it does not have, in the eyes of the international community, because of its non-recognition, the same continental shelf or territorial waters. So Turkey felt once again as a victim in this region and tried to find a way to inject itself to the region by its own oil and gas exploration efforts. And the agreement, the Maritime Agreement that came late last year, was an attempt by the Erdogan government to figure out a country that would work with Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean, that would help Turkey's ambitions to engage in oil and gas exploration, and if not, to basically paralyze, to become a spoiler for other countries' attempts to do that. So it began with this focus on the Eastern Mediterranean issue. And I think overall, it quickly evolved into also an attempt by Erdogan to project some power to the Middle East in the context of the larger militarization of Turkish diplomacy that we have seen recently in Syria, in Iraq, but also in the Gulf of Aden, in Turkey's relations with Sudan and Somalia, where Turkey has a base, in Turkey's relations with Qatar, where Turkey has a military base. There's an overall militarization of Turkish diplomacy and a more assertive Turkish strategic doctrine called now the Blue Homeland Strategy. So Libya has become a testing ground for this Blue Homeland maritime assertive forward defense strategy of Turkey. And Turkey began to test some of its armed drones, air defense systems in Libya. So Libya has become a kind of testing ground for Turkey's own military industrial complex. And it quickly bears some benefits for Erdogan at a time when he desperately needed a kind of military success. As I mentioned also, there's a larger geostrategic struggle going on in the Middle East between Turkey's vision of the Middle East. Turkey wants the Middle East to move towards a more Muslim Brotherhood dominated region. And there is still the kind of Arab Spring in the legacy of this. The Arab Spring brought to power in Egypt the Muslim Brotherhood. The way the Muslim Brotherhood was ousted by a military coup in Egypt has not been accepted by Erdogan. So in his eyes, the government of Egypt under the leadership of Sisi is an illegitimate government supported by countries that are status quo oriented, that are against democracy in the Middle East. Erdogan sees himself and political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood in the context of democracy. He believes if there were elections tomorrow in the Middle East, in Libya, in Algeria, in Morocco, in Jordan, the Muslim Brotherhood will come to power. So it's people's power. And this large march of the Muslim Brotherhood of democracy to power has been halted at the center of the Middle East in Egypt. So he has a score to settle with Egypt. So that's also part of the geostrategic dimension. And finally, as I said, despite this kind of grandiose vision of Turkey, there are levels of delusions of grandeur because Turkey's economic power is not there. Turkey is not really an economic powerhouse. Turkey is going through a very difficult time at home due to inflation, unemployment, bad governance. Erdogan lost elections last year in Istanbul, in Ankara, in all over the country, municipal elections, and he desperately needs to divert attention from his domestic troubles. So that's also part of the struggle that Erdogan is engaged in Libya. In Syria, things are not going well for Turkey. It has been an embarrassment for Erdogan, the situation in Idlib, where very likely Russian forces were involved in the killing of dozens of Turkish troops. And the situation with the Kurdish problem in Turkey with the PKK is not going well. Turkey has a major Kurdish problem. So Erdogan needs to divert attention from all his regional and domestic problems to a victory. And Libya is as close as it gets to a victory for Turkey right now. The problem, however, I will end with this, is that the Turkish people are not biting. This is not an issue that is interesting Turkish people. Turkish people are more interested in bread and butter at home. They don't understand why Turkey is fighting in Libya, and they don't understand the larger geostrategic question. Erdogan is trying to explain to them that this is about existential interests, but overall he has a very hard time to make the conflict in Libya relevant for Turkey, for Turkish domestic public. And in that sense, it's a failure for Turkey. We cannot hear you, Dr. Ibtisam. You're unmuted.
Unmute myself. I'm sorry. Thank you, Omar. Dr. Michael, what strategy has the U.S. adopted to achieve its vision in the Libyan conflict? What are the major shifts that took place in this strategy? To what extent does Washington perception correspond to its strategy in the Libyan conflict? Although you are saying they are not interested, I do believe there is American interest in Libya.
I agree with you that there are American interests, and I'm not defending my country's indifference and inattention to what's happening in Libya. So please let me be clear about that point. I think we are making a mistake. The interesting thing, however, is that we made the mistake in the Obama administration too. And of course, President Obama and President Trump are very different people. And most of their respective supporters would hate to have them ever lumped together on any issue. But on Libya, they share a common perspective, which is it doesn't matter. And they're both wrong. And with Obama, his theory of the case was, building on what Omer Tashbinar said earlier, since Europe is closer, let Europe handle it. It was sort of Obama's effort at forcing more burden sharing within the Western alliance. Trump, of course, is notorious for threatening to withdraw from NATO or pull US troops out of Germany or South Korea or what have you. But Obama had a burden sharing strategy. It wasn't quite as vocal. It wasn't quite as edgy, but it was probably equally unsuccessful in regard to Libya, which was just to sort of hope that the Europeans would do what needed to be done, and that the Libyans were sincere and correct when they seemed to be saying that they did not want any outside help. But as a result, the Obama administration essentially repeated the mistake of the Bush administration from Iraq. In both cases, we were way too hopeful about what would happen after we overthrew a dictator. And in Iraq, we overthrew Saddam with our own forces and a US-led coalition. At least we had some military capability in Iraq to try to create stability, but we failed in the early years. And in Libya, we didn't try at all. So I'm just setting up the point that if that was the way we thought about it during the Obama administration, which is a relatively, serious, traditional, professional American government, I think that it becomes entirely unsurprising that the Trump administration would not even have a strategy. And I really believe they don't. So that is the short answer to your question. Trump was thinking of aligning himself with Russia, UAE, Egypt, France in support of Haftar. But he chose ultimately not to after that famous or infamous phone call, because of course that flew in the face of the longstanding US policy in support of the UN effort in Libya. But the UN effort has been relatively unsuccessful as well. So I would not really call that a strategy, because I suppose you could say it's our nominal strategy to try to help Siraj and his team gradually assert authority. But that process has been so unsuccessful for so long that I would hesitate to call it a meaningful strategy. So I really don't think we have a strategy. And the last point I'll make is that I do know from the early Trump years, there were certain people in the US government who recognized we didn't really have a Libya strategy and asked around the think tank world in Washington for some ideas. And that was about as close as we came to having the strategic debate. But those people are no longer in the Trump administration, at least the ones I'm personally aware of, who had this interest in Libya. And therefore, I really think we revert back to inattention, indifference, and a complete lack of a meaningful strategy. That's where we are.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Kortonov, what is Russia's strategy to achieve its vision in the Libyan conflict? What trade-offs may it take, may it make in both issues of Syria and Libya?
Well, first of all, let me say that in my personal view, for President Putin, it is a very emotional issue. And it goes back to what happened in 2011. The perception in the Kremlin was, whether it is right or wrong, it's another question, but the perception was that somehow the West outsmarted Russia and China as well, and interpreted very loosely the resolution that allowed for a foreign engagement in Libya. And definitely the perception is that the West went far beyond the language of the resolution, and therefore when Libya started to unravel, I think there was a sense of sort of rightness. You know, we told you, you know, we warned you, we suggested that you shouldn't do that. You ignored our position. You abused the United Nations Security Council resolution of 1973, and now you have to face the consequences. So for some time, I think Putin was very reluctant to get involved because he wanted the West to pay the price, so to say, for its short-sighted decision to intervene in Libya. Later on, I think this position has changed. And with this assumed success in Syria, I think they made a decision in Moscow. Well, you know, we more or less fixed Syria, though, again, you can question this assumption whether Syria is fixed or not, but we managed Syria. Let us show that we can also fix Libya better than some other powers can do that. And I think that the climax of this strategy was the meeting in Moscow earlier this year, but Haftar turned out to be an extremely difficult partner. And I think that Russia has opted for a broader coalition with Europeans, and therefore Russia participated in the meeting in Berlin and agreed to discuss a new United Nations Security Council resolution on Syria. However, having said that, I think that Russia is still hesitant to somehow clarify its position on Libya in detail. It is trying to balance its relations with major external powers, which have very conflicting interests in Syria, in Libya, in Libya. And maybe after the US election in November, the Russian position will become clearer because we will have a better understanding what the United States is up to. But let me argue once again that it's not exactly Libya which matters. It is the relations of Russia with its partners in the MENA region, but also in the West, which will define the ultimate Russian position on the conflict in Libya?
Thank you, Andre. Ambassador Millet, what are the key strategies adopted by European actors vis-à-vis the Libyan conflict? What are the potential shifts in these strategies?
Well, I think you have to divide the various European players. Clearly, France has decided that it wants to retain very close relations with the Emirates, with Egypt, and therefore has supported Haftar in his both his military and his political ambitions. And they have protected Haftar both at the Security Council and at the European Council. I think French strategy is in very great difficulty now because they can see that Haftar has lost the battle for Tripoli, and they're not quite sure how to jump. I think Italy continues to have a strategy which is partly based on its economic interests and its dependence on oil and gas coming from Libya. Italy sees itself as the colonial power, and they want to be number one in terms of the European players in Libya. And if you recall, back in 2017 and 18, there was competition as to who was going to host which summit. There was a Paris summit, there was a La Celle-Saint-Cloud, there was a Palermo summit. They were trying to show that they were the key players. I think the rest of the European Union doesn't have a major interest. The Greeks and the Cypriots have taken an interest because of the Maritime Agreement that the Tripoli signed with Ankara, but there is a real lack of overall strategy there. I think Germany has a strategy which is to support what they call the Berlin process, but it needs a much more forceful and united international effort behind some sort of UN effort. There is no UN special envoy at the moment. The acting special envoy, Stephanie Williams, is very good, but she doesn't have the backing of the Security Council. So I think there's a real lack of European voice and a lack of coherent European strategy. Different countries are playing it for very narrow, short-term interests. And I think the Europeans are losing an opportunity to play a significant role in a country that is very important to them in terms of security and prosperity.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Omar, factors and determinants of Turkey's national security have overlapped with the ideological dimension in building its strategy vis-à-vis the Libyan conflict. That was evident in its alliance with Islamists in Libya. And as you mentioned, will there be potential shifts to this strategy in light of Turkey's role in both conflicts of Syria and Libya?
It's a very good question. And I think the way Turkey used some of the Syrian mercenaries that it has worked with, Syrian Islamist jihadist groups in Libya, shows that the way Erdogan thinks about Libya has some echoes of Syria in it. It is true that Turkey sees the region in a certain ideological lens, but let's not also forget that Erdogan can be quite Machiavellian and pragmatic. He has an ideological side, but he has also an equally strong pragmatic and Machiavellian side. And he believes that in many ways, Libya in the Turkish overall strategy, in addition to playing the role of a disruptor and a spoiler in the Eastern Mediterranean, can play dividends in terms of Turkey's relations with three major actors. And these actors are Russia, the United States, and the European Union. So in Turkey's relations with Russia, the first thing to underline is that despite this talk about this partnership between the Sultan and the Tsar, the relations between Turkey and Russia at the strategic level are void of major strategic convergence. Turkey and Russia do not see eye to eye in any issue of strategic significance in their neighborhood, ranging from Syria to Libya to Egypt to the Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Cyprus. You cannot name one single issue, perhaps with the exception of faraway Venezuela, where Putin and Erdogan are really on the same page. So this is a marriage of convenience based on trade relations, based on energy, based on financial contracts, etc. But one issue is clear. Turkey believed that by investing in Libya, it could turn Syria into a kind of leverage with Putin, because the big issue for Turkey is Idlib and the refugee crisis in Idlib that is bordering Turkey. And Russia's position in Idlib is very clear. Russia has the upper hand in Syria militarily. So Turkey believed that by playing the Libya card, it could put Putin into a more a manageable situation in Syria and could basically pave the way for a grand bargain over both Libya and Syria in terms of Turkey's relations with Putin. And this was one attempt to gain leverage over Syria to a certain degree. So that's one way of reading this Libya strategy as leverage for Syria in Turkey's relations with Russia. As far as the United States is concerned, Turkey is desperate to figure out ways to revitalize its partnership with Washington. In the aftermath of the S-400 debacle and the F-35 air project, the F-35 sales that has been canceled to Turkey, Turkey is trying to figure out whether Libya can become an area of strategic cooperation between Washington and Ankara. And in that sense, Russia's entry to Libya was very important for Turkey in terms of presenting the issue to Putin, to Trump as a NATO alliance that would protect basically Libya from Russian interference. And I know that President Erdogan tried also to play the oil card, to which he believes President Trump is susceptible. He said, there's oil, you know, if you come in, we can engage together, and Turkey and Libya can, Turkey and United States can be the main players in Libya in terms of oil and gas exploration. But as I said, the Trump administration and President Trump did not really go full front on that, and there's reluctance in terms of the White House to get involved. And finally, on the European Union, Turkey wanted to prove, as it did with the refugee cards that it has, or Syrian refugees, that in Libya, it can hold some leverage in its relations with the European Union, that Turkey is a force to reckon with for both France, for Cyprus, for Greece, that if Turkey is not on board, the European Union cannot really exert influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it was an attempt in the Turkish strategy with the European Union, which is totally blocked at this point. There's a major deadlock in Turkey-EU relations in terms of showing the Europeans that they need to have a Turkey strategy, that they cannot forever delay the Turkish question of membership, that there has to be an attempt to figure out a strategy to deal with Turkey on so many levels, on Syria, on the refugees, on the Eastern Mediterranean, that there has to be a more robust strategy coming from Germany, France, Italy, in terms of what to do with Turkey. They cannot ignore Turkey in the region. They cannot sideline Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Libya proves in that sense to the European Union that Turkey is a force to reckon with.
Excellent. Thank you, Omar. Michael, as the coronavirus crisis has not yet forced any of the world powers to change their strategies and foreign policies, how does this contribute to prolonging the Libyan conflict?
Well, you know, it would be a nice opportunity for President Trump and President Putin to actually do something productive with their desire to get along. And maybe that's the best way I can answer your question. I'm not sure if my Russian colleague agrees, but partly because Libya matters less to both Russia and the United States than some of the other countries where there is competition between Russia and the United States. Maybe this would be a place that we could actually collaborate. Sometimes it's easier to start with smaller things rather than Ukraine or even Syria. And so I would welcome the chance to see this. And frankly, President Trump should have been looking for this sort of thing, because he could have then used this as a way to say, listen, I don't just like Vladimir Putin because he's a strong man. I like him because he knows how to get results. And I think the US-Russia relationship needs to be calmer and less dangerous. And I'm interested in defusing it. That would have been the smart way, in my opinion, for President Trump to take his initial instincts on Russia and Putin and move them in a productive direction that would have actually had some potential merit to the argument. Unfortunately, Trump has just really sat on his hands. Everyone knows that he sort of still likes Vladimir Putin, and maybe vice versa. But those two leaders have done nothing productive with the 3.5 years that they've been in office together, with the partial exception of sanctioning North Korea together after the missile and nuclear tests of 2017. Besides that issue, I can't really think of any place where Russia and the United States have managed to walk back the tension in their relationship or look for a more positive way to collaborate. And so I think, frankly, that both those leaders have wasted an opportunity. And even though I'm a critic of both of them and don't support either one, I would have still welcomed an opportunity to see the US-Russia relationship taken down a notch of intensity and venom and toxicity and danger. And Libya could have been an opportunity. Maybe it still is, but I don't see any movement right now.
Thank you. Andre.
Well, you know, frankly, if I were to advise...
You want to comment on what Michael is saying?
Yeah, I just want to say very, very briefly, if I were to advise both Trump and Putin to demonstrate that they are able to work together on Middle East issues, I would probably suggest to start with Yemen, which in my view is a low-hanging fruit right now. And definitely it is much easier to reconcile all the positions, especially right now. However, I agree that Libya, compared to Syria, is also an opportunity, since Iran is not engaged in Libya, and both countries have relatively low stakes in this conflict. My personal guess is that Putin would love to cut a deal with Trump because that would give him a kind of legitimacy, a recognition that he can work on equal footing with the American superpower. And even if Trump is not re-elected, that would be left in history as a major accomplishment of President Putin. But I think that the hesitation in Moscow is that even if Trump agrees on that, the question is whether he can deliver, given the fact that, of course, the Congress is not really working with Trump in a consistent way, and the elections are approaching. So I think that this is the reservation that they understand. And I agree that definitely both leaders wasted these almost 4 years, which they could have and probably should have used to demonstrate their ability to work together, at least on relatively small and not too divisive issues.
So Andre, from your perspective, which actors can change the game in Libya if they increase their investment in the country?
My take is that there are a couple of players, and we all know these players. One of the problems with the Berlin meeting, which I have, in my view, that was a too broad meeting, too many participants, but definitely there should be an agreement that can be translated into a very specific arrangement. And some of the parameters of this arrangement were already mentioned here, the United Nations involvement. I would probably add the economic dimension. I think it's critically important to have a mechanism that would monitor the performance of the Libyan National Bank and the National Oil Company of Libya. Because if one can somehow deprive the fighting sides from the financial resources that they use right now, that might allow at least to downscale the conflict, to decrease the intensity of the conflict. And again, let me say that in my opinion, there are players and representatives of these countries are around this table today to demonstrate that they can act not against each other, but together with each other. I think that there is nothing that cannot be done given the current situation in Libya. I don't think that there are contradictions which are completely irreconcilable. Any solution will not be perfect, but I think that the solution is still not beyond our reach.
Okay. Ambassador Mellet, you were in Libya. So in your review also, what are the main factors that have hindered the efforts of the UN envoy for Libya and other efforts such as the Berlin conference?
Well, first of all, the internal factor was what Hassan Salameh called the status quo party. The various Libyans who are benefiting from the current stalemate, who are in positions of power and enjoying those positions of power. And that includes the militias in Tripoli who are milking the state for resources, and the vast number of people, of Libyans, who have joined militias because it gives them an easy salary. So weaning the militia members off, having an SSR and DDR process, but somehow you need a political process within Libya. It has to be Libyan owned, and a negotiation between Libyans to establish a new national agenda. That agenda has to be political, military, and economic, as Dr. Andre has said. That was missing from the Sahara Agreement. Economic reform, whether it goes as far as a sort of decentralized economy that Dr. Michael O'Hanlon has mentioned, long-term diversification away from oil and gas, but all of that has to be part of a national agenda. But without international cohesion backing that process, it's not going to work. And as Dr. Omar has said, the risk of miscalculation now, the risk of Turkey trying to push beyond Sirte and Jufra, the risk of an Egyptian response to that is very significant. So the key point at the moment is, will it be escalation or will it be negotiation? There really has to be a ceasefire, the lifting of the oil blockade, and getting back to a UN-led, Libyan-owned political process that sets in train a new political process. They're not going to solve it immediately, but there will inevitably have to be a transitional period. But that cannot work and will not work unless the Libyans themselves are willing to compromise, and unless the international community is willing to get behind that effort.
So can it be this conflict solved if it's left to Libyan?
No, it can't be left to Libyan, but it needs a much broader range of Libyan stakeholders. But at the moment, many of those stakeholders are being backed and pushed in one direction or another by the outside powers. So it needs both a clear direction with Libyans themselves negotiating that political, military and economic deal, but with unified support. And that's what is not there at the moment. The different competing alliances are pushing this in a very dangerous direction.
Thank you. Dr. Omar, will the countries fighting for Libya contribute to the reconstruction of the country when the war comes to an end, mainly Turkey?
This is certainly part of the calculations of Erdogan. The reason why he is investing so much in Libya is not because he has a good heart and he wants to see the future of Libya evolve into a liberal democracy. He believes that Libya is a place where Turkish construction companies, which is the lifeline of the Turkish economy, can play a major role. I think under Gaddafi, Turkey had half a dozen Turkish construction companies invested in Libya to the tune of $20 to $25 billion. So the dream of Erdogan is, of course, post-conflict reconstruction in a Libya where the government is open to Turkish contracts and is willing to reward Turkey with this kind of clientelistic patronage networks. The fear that I have, however, as we focus on this question of post-conflict and or power sharing, or what will happen, what actors will be benefiting, is the very essence of the problem in Libya and in some other places in the Middle East, which have to do with the fact that we are not dealing with what we can call in, I guess, political science or political anthropology, organic states. These are not natural states. Very often we're dealing with weak states, artificial states, with states that are products of post-colonial creation and with either deep sectarian divisions or deep tribal divisions. And these need not go to the argument of ancient tribal hatreds, but these are basically real divisions of the country. And the only way these countries, which are weak, divided, either sectarian or tribally, are held together is true, unfortunately, in the recorded history of the region by strongmen like Saddam Hussein in Iraq or Gaddafi in Libya. In the absence of this kind of iron fist, what will keep Libya together, this kind of tribal divisions, this kind of organic divisions together? There's power sharing. The power sharing agreements that we are all hoping requires institutions. And when there are no institutions of power sharing, we often say, you know, United Nations can create maybe some power sharing mechanism, but the United Nations first needs to provide governance. There has to be some level of security, some level of capacity, some level of legitimacy. My concern is that, you know, when we look at successful states, how they emerge, they often emerge through civil wars. I'll take the country where I come from, Turkey. Turkey is a product of a major civil war. The modern Turkey is a product of the Armenian genocide. There are no more Armenians left, and the de-Hellenization of Anatolia. There are no more Greeks left. So there has been a civil war, and the ethnic minorities of Turkey have been decimated. And now we're dealing with the Kurds as a kind of additional problem. So civil wars, at the end of the day, create institutions. When in the United States, there has been a civil war out of these civil wars. Now we're trying to say, no, we have to stop the civil wars. We have to establish peace mechanisms. And I'm afraid what we will end up with, as it often happens, is a situation where we may try to avoid genocide, large-scale conflict, but we will end up with a kind of short-term situation where a strong state, or even not a viable state, will be able to emerge.
Thank you, Omar. This question for both Michael and Ambassador Millet. Why has not conflict been resolved militarily by one actor yet? And who are the beneficiaries of prolonging the conflict in Libya? Michael, then Ambassador.
Well, it's always smart to ask that question, even though we hate to think of anyone benefiting from conflict. I think in the broader scheme, you could say this is one more way of keeping oil off the market. So it's good for other oil producers. But the amount of oil that's at issue here, while important for Libya, is not huge by global oil market standards. And compared to all the effects from the COVID-19 crisis, as well as the ongoing discussions within OPEC and elsewhere, I think the effects of whether Libyan oil is on the market or not in large quantity are relatively minor. So I'm not going to accuse anyone of fomenting or tolerating the civil war because it keeps oil prices higher. I don't really think that's a main driver. We have heard Omer and Andre and others talk about historical ties with certain countries, including their own, to Libya and previous historical economic and political relationships. So I'm sure there are certain specific companies or individuals or actors within Europe that may benefit from one type of existing status quo relationship or another. However, I'm not going to push that argument too far either, because nobody really benefits that much from chaos. There may be some warlords who benefit a little bit from chaos, but most of those warlords are Libyan. And so some of the economic partners of those warlords may temporarily benefit, but I don't see any countries that at a national level really stand to benefit from keeping Libya in the state it's in today. I think it's really bad for everybody. And therefore, all the more reason I'm grateful that you're having this forum, so we don't completely forget the importance of efforts to try to mitigate and ultimately end the war and stabilize the country.
Ambassador Millet?
I mean, I think your first question, why has there been no military solution? As we saw with Haftar, his power grab for Tripoli, it is too big a country, it is deeply fragmented. There were many groups from Misrata and from elsewhere who were simply not prepared to accept that Haftar could win. I remember the town council of Misrata telling me in 2016 or 17, we fought for 42 years to get rid of Gaddafi. We're not going to accept a new military dictator. So I think there was never going to be a military solution. It was the mantra that the UN used to promote, but it's a fact that there cannot be any military winners. And I think even if there were an escalation from Turkey with a response from Egypt, it would get very nasty and very bloody very quickly. And I don't think that would succeed. I think in terms of the beneficiaries, I agree with Dr. Michael O'Hanlon that I don't think there are any external beneficiaries, but clearly there are internal Libyan beneficiaries who are winning at the moment, who are very comfortable with their positions of political power, and the militias and others who are milking the system, who are exploiting the economy for their own purposes, and therefore getting out of that status quo element is going to be a real challenge, so that those Libyans are willing to give up what they've won so far and compromise for the greater good of the country. I don't see that mindset at the moment, I'm afraid.
And they can be proxies for regional or international beneficiaries.
Yes, but I think they are benefiting personally. There's a lot of individuals there, particularly some of the militia leaders in Tripoli, who are benefiting personally, and many small-time players who are also benefiting personally, who fear both losing their income and then fear the repercussions that would follow from any compromise.
Thank you. This question, please be brief because we are approaching the end of the webinar. For both of you, Dr. Kortunov and Dr. Tashfina. As the conflict in Libya reflects the complexity of struggle in the international and regional orders, how can countries directly affected by this conflict avoid a chronic security risk and threats emerging from this crisis in the future? Dr. Kortunov first.
I think that one of the problems here is that, unfortunately, and sorry to be cynical, but the crisis in Libya is generally affordable. You know, it doesn't create immediate risks and immediate challenges to great powers, and they can live with it for some time at least. I think that they should probably reassess strategic repercussions of these crises, including a potential for its vertical or horizontal escalation, including escalation to the south. And definitely it's also a matter of trust, which is extremely difficult right now. I think that one of the clear conclusions from the crisis that we can make is that no one trusts anyone else. And that prevents us from taking decisions which are necessary and which will meet interests of all major players.
Thank you. Dr. Tashbinar, briefly, please.
Yes, I think for Turkey, the risk of escalation is very real. The risk of miscalculation is very real in terms of what Erdogan will do. I don't see Erdogan at this point taking basically a kind of visionary role. He seems to be focused on the short term. So unfortunately, in the absence of a major player, and that could be normally the United States, that could bring some order, some sense, some dialogue, things will probably have to get worse in Libya before they get better. And in the meantime, the risk of escalation is very real.
Thank you. I think also sometimes if there's no order or disorders, maybe it's benefiting many actors if there is order, or left it like that. At the end, I would really and sincerely thank you very much. This excellent discussion. I would apologize for those whom they send their question from the attendees. I think we cover most of the issues in our webinars today, and with this excellent speaker, Dr. Michael, Dr. Korchanov, Ambassador Millet, Dr. Omar, thank you so much. And we are looking forward to host you again, not virtually, in Abu Dhabi in our annual conference. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you and bye. Good luck.
Thank you.